The year was 1942, and the Allied forces were bleeding out on the high seas. Across the dark, freezing expanses of the Atlantic and the vast, perilous stretches of the Pacific, the ocean floor was rapidly transforming into a graveyard of twisted metal and sunken ambitions. The Axis powers had calculated that the easiest way to strangle the Allied war effort was not necessarily to defeat their armies on the battlefield, but to cut the invisible arteries of supply that kept those armies alive. German U-boats were hunting in terrifying wolf packs, torpedoing merchant vessels with devastating precision, while the Imperial Japanese Navy, riding the high tide of its early conquests, was expanding its perimeter across the Pacific. Ships were going down significantly faster than they could be built. The math was brutally simple, and it heavily favored the Axis. If Britain could be starved of food and munitions, and if the American forces in the Pacific could be isolated and cut off from their home ports, the war would be lost before the boots of the Allied soldiers could even touch the ground. The United States found itself facing an impossible logistical nightmare. To fight a two-front war on opposite sides of the globe, they needed a bridge of ships, an armada of unprecedented scale. But traditional shipbuilding was an ancient, meticulous craft, a slow and laborious process where vessels were custom-built from the keel up by master craftsmen. A single merchant ship could take up to 8 months to complete. Time was a luxury the free world simply no longer possessed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that a radical paradigm shift was the only answer. He announced an emergency shipbuilding program, famously calling the proposed vessels a dreadful-looking object and an ugly duckling. But aesthetics did not win wars. Tonnage did. The answer to this existential crisis came not from traditional naval architects or seasoned maritime engineers, but from an industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had previously never built a ship in his life. Kaiser was a master of grand-scale infrastructure, the man who had helped build the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam. When he looked at a shipyard, he did not see a place to craft individual ships. He saw a manufacturing plant. Kaiser realized that if he applied the principles of Henry Ford's automotive assembly line to maritime construction, the impossible could be achieved. The blueprint chosen for this monumental task was based on a simple, reliable British design, heavily modified for mass production. It was officially designated the EC-SC-1, but history would remember it as the Liberty ship. The design was stripped of all non-essential features. It was not fast, maxing out at a sluggish 11 knots. It was not pretty, with a blunt bow and a boxy silhouette, but it was entirely functional, incredibly spacious, and most importantly, it was designed to be built by largely unskilled laborers to achieve the explosive rate of production required. Kaiser and his contemporaries had to completely reinvent how a ship was put together. For centuries, ships had been held together by millions of steel rivets. Riveting was a specialized, exhausting skill. 2-man crews had to heat the rivets until they were glowing white, throw them, catch them, insert them, and hammer them flat. It was deafening, slow, and labor-intensive. The revolutionary pivot came with the widespread adoption of arc welding. Welding was faster, required less steel, and critically, it was a skill that could be taught to a novice in a matter of weeks. The second massive innovation was modular prefabrication. Instead of building the entire ship on the slipway, piece by piece, massive sections of the ship's hull, the deckhouses, and the bulkheads were built inland in separate factories. These massive, pre-assembled chunks of steel, sometimes weighing over 100 tons, were transported to the shipyards via heavy rail lines and massive custom-built cranes. The shipyard itself ceased to be a place of construction and became merely the final point of assembly. A ship was no longer built. It was snapped together like a giant industrial puzzle. This logistical revolution required a workforce of staggering proportions. And this demand arose precisely when the majority of able-bodied American men were being drafted into the armed forces. The solution sparked one of the most profound social transformations in American history. Millions of women, alongside minorities who had previously been barred from such lucrative industrial jobs, flooded into the shipyards. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter should, in the context of the Liberty ships, actually be Wendy the Welder. These women worked around the clock in harrowing, dangerous conditions. The shipyards, under the glare of massive floodlights, amid a continuous, deafening symphony of grinding metal, hissing torches, and roaring cranes. 3 shifts worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a chaotic, dangerous, but incredibly synchronized ballet of heavy industry. 18 emergency shipyards were constructed from scratch across the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast. Sleepy mudflats and empty coastlines were transformed overnight into sprawling industrial metropolises. The sheer scale of the mobilization was intoxicating. Factories in the Midwest that had once stamped out automobile parts were now churning out ship engines and propellers. Steel mills in Pennsylvania ran white-hot, feeding a seemingly bottomless appetite for metal. The entire American industrial juggernaut had been violently awakened, pivoted, and hyper-focused onto a single, obsessive goal: replacing sunken tonnage faster than the enemy could pull the trigger. The Axis submarines and destroyers were still hunting, still sinking ships by the dozens, but they were about to encounter a terrifying mathematical reality. They were no longer fighting a navy. They were fighting the limitless output of an entire continent. The results of this industrial revolution were nothing short of miraculous, shattering every preconceived notion of manufacturing speed. Before the war, a typical merchant ship took about 230 days to build. By 1942, the average production time for a Liberty ship had plummeted to just 39 days. But the shipyards, engaged in fierce, patriotic competitions with one another, were not satisfied with averages. In a legendary publicity stunt designed to boost national morale and strike psychological terror into the hearts of the Axis powers, Kaiser's shipyard in Richmond, California, set out to build the SS Robert E. Peary in record time. On a Sunday morning in November 1942, the keel was laid down. In a blur of orchestrated chaos, thousands of workers descended upon the slipway. Massive prefabricated sections were lowered into place while the steel was still warm from the inland factories. Welders crawled over the structure like ants, stitching the colossal steel beast together in a blinding shower of sparks. Just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched into the water, fully assembled, painted, and ready for action. It was a feat of industrial magic that defied logic. While this was a heavily orchestrated stunt, the daily reality was equally staggering. at the peak of production. American shipyards were launching 3 brand-new Liberty ships into the water every single day for the Imperial Japanese military leadership. This American production miracle was a harbinger of absolute doom. Japan's entire strategic calculus in the Pacific theater relied on a short, sharp war. They believed that by crippling the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and rapidly seizing resource-rich territories, they could establish a defensive perimeter so vast and so deadly that the United States would lose the will to fight across the punishing distances of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific is unfathomably large. A supply line stretching from San Francisco to Guadalcanal or Australia is a logistical nightmare spanning thousands of miles of hostile water. The Japanese correctly calculated that an army without bullets, fuel, or food is simply a group of doomed men. What they failed to calculate was the terrifying scale of American industrial wrath. As the brutal island-hopping campaign commenced, the true value of the Liberty ship became apparent. These ugly ducklings were the unsung beasts of burden that made the Pacific victory possible. A single Liberty ship could carry an astonishing amount of cargo: 2,840 jeeps, or 440 light tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition, or enough food to feed a city. They carried locomotives, crated fighter planes, aviation fuel, and blood plasma. Japanese submarine commanders and fighter pilots fought valiantly, expending precious torpedoes and risking their lives to send American merchant ships to the bottom, and they succeeded often. But the psychological blow came when they looked through their periscopes or down from their cockpits just weeks later. For every vessel they agonizingly managed to sink, 3 more appeared on the horizon, riding low in the water, heavy with the very war machines that would eventually burn the Japanese Empire to the ground. It was an industrial hydra. Cut off one head, and multiple others grew in its place. The Japanese industrial base, heavily reliant on imported materials and traditional craftsmanship, was straining just to replace its combat losses. They could not even begin to comprehend, let alone match, the output of cities like Richmond or Baltimore. American industrial might was replacing sunken vessels literally faster than Japan could count them. The logistical noose was tightening, and there was nothing the Japanese military could do to stop it. The ocean, once a barrier that protected the Japanese homeland, had been paved over by an endless highway of cheap welded steel. The Liberty ships were not without their flaws. The rushed transition to welding, combined with the use of steel that became brittle in the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic and North Pacific, led to catastrophic structural failures. Several ships literally cracked in half while at sea, plunging their crews into the icy depths. They were slow, making them easy targets for submarines, and their crews, the merchant marines, suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the service. Yet they sailed on. They were built for a specific purpose: to outproduce the enemy's capacity to destroy. In that grim, calculated equation, they succeeded flawlessly. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, American shipyards had constructed an unbelievable 2,710 Liberty ships. This single class of vessel represented the greatest shipbuilding effort in the history of the human race. They delivered the tanks that rolled across Europe, the planes that darkened the skies over Tokyo, and the very lifeblood of the Allied war machine. The Axis powers built their strategy on the assumption that warrior spirit and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. But they were crushed under the sheer, inescapable weight of American mass production. The Liberty ship stands today not as a masterpiece of naval architecture, but as the ultimate monument to industrial warfare, a testament to the moment when a nation rolled up its sleeves, turned its factories into battlefields, and simply outbuilt the apocalypse.